I was in banking before, so now that I'm out, I can say whatever I want. Yeah.
Ladies. Quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, please quiet your seats. This session will begin.
Start over. All right, so I'll try again. My name is Doug Hague. I'm now a professor at UNC Charlotte in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was formerly in banking and did a little bit of model development, model risk when I was there. So fortunately, I guess some of you heard the little thing. I'm a professor. I'm in academia now. I don't really have to. I can say whatever I want. And so I'm going to try and look for responsible AI and what's really happening in the future. And coming out of banking and coming into academia, I get a much broader view. I work with a lot of industries now. And so what are the responsibilities of the financial service industry for responsible AI, as well as beyond the financial industry? Does this room, do our regulars up here actually have any responsibilities to the rest of the industries and our government and our world? And so I'm going to try and talk a little bit about that. I'll try and end by 5:30 so that we can kind of continue and move on. But a couple things that we've started at UNC Charlotte. We have a Center for Taming AI. You have to have a cute abbreviation when you do that. It's really trustworthy AI through model risk management. So what the foundation of it is really to try and use the MRM principles and the last, well, let's just call it 15 years. 11.7 wasn't 15 years ago, but there was a little bit before that. These principles that you've worked out in this industry are actually very good. You know, you talk to your regulators, you joke a little bit about them. Sometimes, you know, they're going to ask you to do different things. But the principles and practices that you've developed over the last 15 years are actually very useful. What I worry about is we talked a little bit about the executive order and how 11.7 kind of ran into the executive order, the AI guidelines in Europe, the NIST guidelines in the US. But if you look at the executive order, we've done some work at the university, and there's 422 or something like that little regulations within that executive order. It was the second largest executive order ever. In that, there's something called regulatory lock-in. And so there was a lot of lobbying going on, if you didn't notice that, into that executive order. And a lot of our large tech companies, anybody work for Google, Apple, right now? Because I'm going to criticize them a little bit. Because I can do that well, they'll never fund me, but that's all right. There's a lot of lock-in in that executive order that said, here's what Google said, right? And you can go look, and you can do your NLP and your comparison and your difference in the documents, and there's almost exactly the same language. So I worry about the big tech companies and saying, we talk a lot about model definitions and what's a model and what's not a model. They've actually written into that basically ChatGPT is not a model because it's too small. Okay, so they're only going to regulate things going forward. That's not necessarily where we want to be, because if we all know, as we've developed over the last 15 years, even an Excel spreadsheet can be a model that's very critically important. So the responsibility and the understanding of the financial services industry, my personal opinion is you need to lead the world, right, in understanding and bringing best practices to the other industries. We talked a little bit about healthcare up here. Healthcare, if you go look at their model risk management practices in healthcare, you'll not want to go to a hospital anymore. Okay, because there aren't any model risk management practices. And so that's one of those things as an educator now. You know, we have a school of data science. I helped found a school of data science. We're trying to train. I have 700 students. Please come hire my students, all that kind of stuff. We actually train our master's students on MRM. So there's a whole class, and Goose and his team have graciously helped us do that. But being in Charlotte, we do that. And how we do that is really through a lot of interdisciplinary efforts. So as we founded the school and we work at this, you know, there was a question earlier about the moral grounds, right, of the ethics in the world in that. You know, we talked about, okay, there's ethical AI and explainability or something like that. Well, now that I'm in an academic unit, I have a philosopher, right? It's a professor of philosophy that runs the ethics and actually is written up in Time. So you can go read his work in the special issue on AI in Time about the ethics of AI, right? And you can go back to Hume and all the other pieces. And so there is a moral grounding. The Europeans have taken very much, it's a human right. Here in the United States, we have not done that. But what is the moral grounding and what is the right thing for us to be doing as an entity? And I think financial services has more of a, because of the safety and soundness, you're going to get regulated and you're going to get scrutinized a little bit more than some of the other industries. But the practices you have, right, and the responsible AI that you're going to bring to the rest of the industries that are going to be based on your practices is really important. And us as a university and the other universities, Georgia Tech, other universities around, can be a helper, right? You don't have to do this on your own because you have your own jobs, right? But we are working with you to actually influence our regulators outside of the FRB and OCC and CFPB and every other acronym you wanted to think about. But driving this into NIST, and then what are the practices that NIST is doing that are going to then apply to the United States as well as elsewhere. So as we bring the responsibility to that, I really think that we've got to take that interdisciplinary. I think VJ said earlier that your humanities and your social scientists take a very different approach than computer scientists. Most of us are statisticians, computer scientists, or engineers, right? We take one view of the world. When you start working with the humanists and the social scientists that have a very different view of the world and a very different approach to research and how to do things, right? That brings a different viewpoint in, right? And I was talking to our philosophy faculty the other day and said, what if you were inside a corporation, right? Academics don't like to think that way, but if you were inside a corporation, what would you do and how would they actually leverage you? And some corporations have tried this, right? And then they fired them, right? So Timnit Gebru and some of the others were actually inside corporations, and then later corporations didn't like it and they got rid of them for various and different reasons. But how we do that as a world, as a financial services industry, and bring these different viewpoints in are one of those things that I think, the financial services has to do that, right? But I also worry about when I talk to my MRM partners around, right? When we talk about responsible AI or trustworthiness or fairness or bias you guys will do all right on because I can mathematically define that. For fairness, all of a sudden they're like, oh, the guys in compliance do that, right? I don't think that's the right answer. I know some of you do, and in your corporations, as the regulators had said, it's up to your corporate culture on where and how this will happen, and that's very true. But when you think about MRM and fairness and value, right, and bias, you need to think about have a lot of the expertise. Do we need another MRM team built in compliance to do the fairness and bias? Maybe. Right? That could be right for your corporation, but I think as we take it out of financial services and into other things, most other companies aren't going to have the power and the ability to have a separate compliance group. So what are the best practices that we have that we would be able to then say, okay, healthcare, okay, technology, okay, retail services, okay, manufacturing, what else should you be doing with your models? Because they all have models, they're all adopting this. You're the ones that are being more regulated than anyone else. Having felt that before and now looking in from the outside, you're very, very regulated and rigid, sometimes too much, about how you manage models. But the world needs this, and so what are the responsibilities of us? I'll include myself in that, and being able to do that. And so I think it is one of those things that as you look to say, if I have all computer scientists on my room, or I have all of one particular type of person in my room, that I'm building these, you really need to look. And diversity, equity, and inclusion has got all kinds of political implications now. It didn't used to be, but it's really diversity of thought and how you bring it. Because one of the things I think academic people did, right, in the responsible AI and the fair AI, we screamed. Right? And there are still, humanists, philosophers, social scientists that are screaming about how unfair and biased AI is. I think their problem is they never think about, well, what does it mean to implement that, right? You are sitting there and saying, okay, I know I can never have a fair model. It's never going to be perfectly fair. How do you make the right trade-offs to do that? They'll not accept that. So as we bring in and think about the partnerships between academic and industry and government, how do we bring in this, what's appropriate to do? You know, there's somebody's going to come up with a metric, I bet it's a computer scientist, right, that says 20% error rate is fine. Unfair rate of 20% is fine, right? That's never going to be fine all the time, but what and how do you make those decisions when you're looking through this? That's really where I think the extension of what we're doing here in financial services is going to move us over the next 10 years, right? The AI is going to continue to evolve, right? We'll have those models moving up and saying they're better and better and better. But what is our responsibility for financial services and for the rest of the country and for the world? So that's one of the things I tend to think about. When I think about this, you know, we've broken our work into three areas. It's really the mathematical foundations, right? And so we've developed a recent enhancement to a binning technique, right? And so what's a fair binning technique? How do you manage this? Do you have equal bins? Do you have other bins? How do you do this? And so that's some of the work we're doing in our center, and we're going to put it in PyML, right? And so we're trying to implement this in so that the rest of the world and the outsourcing that H2O, or not outsourcing, the open sourcing that we're doing in H2O and elsewhere in PyML is one of the things we really believe in, because when we build that as a financial service, it can then go out to the other industries. Maybe they're not ready for it now, maybe they're ready for it next year or the next year, but it'll be there. It's a tool that they can use. And so the mathematical foundations, the uncertainty quantification, where your model's weak is step one, right? And so generally in the past we had some very general, right, areas and statistics that said overall, globally, your model is weak here, or it's this good, right? Or my area under the curve is this. Well, what we're starting to go to is where's your model weaks in the state space of your data that you trained it on. So it's not weak everywhere, may be strong in some areas and weak in others. So we first have to identify all of that. And so as we do that, that's kind of where the financial services business is now, is finding all of this and then putting the controls over it. So once you know where it's weak, then you have to have controls. So I heard a lot of controls up here, you know, what's your control over it? But there's also other areas of academic research that can bring in, it's called control theory, right? It's really out of mechanical engineering and engineering that really work at controls. And so a lot of the controls around GenAI right now are fragile, right? Because we went through jailbreaking this morning, right? And you saw how easy it was to break and control. Well, that means the control is fragile. So how do you make and ensure and bring in robustness techniques to actually build more robust controls over the top? And so when and where you decide to put controls, a lot of times it's, I'm not going to go into that space at all right now, right? We're just not going to allow Gen AI in customer-facing applications. That is a control, right? The other control over top of that is SR11.7. That is a control that then tells you how to control your management. And so this hierarchy of controls in a system level thinking is really how we're doing this. So that's the second area, and then the third area is the moral boundaries, and how do we as academia and you as financial services really respond to those RFIs. So there's RFIs coming out from government agencies almost every week, right? And so when and how do your companies respond? Do you respond through the banking associations? Do you respond otherwise? Or do we, as an academic, respond and try and consolidate some of the information from you and actually state a position that we can get our regulators to actually change on? So by these three areas, we're really trying to foundationally move the mathematics, build a control system that not only financial services can use, but also other industries, and really do this in a fair and unbiased way, or as fair and unbiased as you can be, because there's wonderful academic papers that say you can never be perfectly fair. So we're never going to be perfectly fair, but we can be better than we are today. And that incremental improvement is really where I think we need to go, and where I think the open source community is trying to go, building all the different techniques to find where the uncertainty is in our models, building the test methods, and then deciding what controls to put over those, right? And monitoring, every time you go and talk to a new industry or a new company that isn't in financial services, and you talk about, number one, do you have a list of models? Generally, the answer is no. Okay, almost no company outside of financial services keeps an inventory of models. And then if they do happen to do that, have you ever gone back and seen how it's performing today? I mean, the worst model I ever found when I was in a bank was 16 or I think it was 15 or 16 that we found. This was a 1998 FICO model that was still operating, right? It was basically a random choice, right? And so you were randomly handing out credit. So we changed all of that, but that was only because we started to do an inventory. And so as you do that, do you know if your models are still good? That's not a question. I mean, we talk about that all the time, right? Monitoring this, and we're doing this, and we're going to do annual reviews, and I got to automate my annual reviews because they're so time intensive, and now we're automating the original validation documents. Most industries outside of financial services know nothing about this. Even the technology industry, they only get caught by the press, or they get caught by an academic that then tries to look outside and looks in there and says you're either biased or unfair or that type of thing, and then they'll go change things. But in general, right, there's not a lot of controls that are put in place. Now the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll try and take a couple questions, is really the responsibility for all of us, right? I've gone from a banker, right, that was squeezing the next penny out of the things and understanding the models and doing that, to more of an academic now that we're thinking about this and really thinking about what happens to our world. So I want you guys to, and this is my challenge to you, think about your skills and your services and what you do and how you can talk to your neighbors, right, and how you can talk to other industries about the practices that you have, right? The practices in this industry, right, are being flowed through the executive order, are being flowed through NIST, are being flowed into the European Union and around the world. But if you don't stand up and say that, the technology company lobbyists are going to come in, right, and the wonderful sound practices that you have are going to get overruled. And so how we do this together, because it's going to take all of us to do this, and your companies are going to have to stand up, and I know, banks don't like to stand up, right, for a lot of this. Now there is a lot of statements about fairness out there, but when they're serving and trying to change government entities, they're very careful about that. And so that's how you can actually use your academic partners, whether it's us, whether it's Georgia Tech, whether it's other people near you. I would encourage you to use your academic partners to be a little bit of your voice. So with that, I'm not going to try and overrule. I'm going to try and finish by 5:30. We got 5 minutes. I'm happy to take a few questions. I think the responsibility and thinking beyond AI and the responsibility towards the future is really where we want to go, and that's really the point I wanted to emphasize today. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And
I'd rather you get this one.
yep.
Hold
We
on
can't
just a
hear you.
moment. Hold on. No.
Hey, we're bringing
this
you
microphone
one.
right here.
It's the old mic runners, right?
There you go. Thank you. All right. I guess this is a question related to the risk controls that you were speaking about. Do you believe a consortium of sorts should be created between the open source generative AI community and regulatory agencies for risk controls?
Okay, so I think that's not a bad idea. I think consortia, there are very few consortia actually successful. So I think one of the things we can do is, like it was interesting, H2O.ai, they said, here's the 7 ways to test your model. And I can't remember the 7 of them, but they're in the PowerPoint from this morning, and you can copy those. That's a good framework, so I think it's more important for the regulators and us and companies and academics to put frameworks out there that others can follow, that then get put into the regulations or the executive orders or others that says, here's now the standard. That's what NIST is trying to do. Here's the standard things that you need to do. And as we're talking to NIST, they're like, okay, now we need to go down to the next level. What are the standard tests? Gen AI now, it's all in the air, right? We don't know. We're making them up as we go, and every university and every other person is trying to come up with a new test that says, here's how good it is. That, as we evolve, I think that's more important. So the frameworks that are then, and I think we have to be careful because we don't want Google, Facebook, Meta, and others to be the dominant voice that says, here's the framework, because that's what's happening today. Their frameworks are making it into the regulations and not a more general framework from the community, and I think the open source community has a very important role to play in that.
All right, great, and actually this is one question from me. The curiosity that I have is, I know that you mentioned that you're teaching 700 data scientists in your college to, you're hoping them to get hired, but there's more than just the math and more than just the theory that we're learning.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a personal question, but how are you equipping your students to enter this market, which is so dynamic, so fast changing? Like, what are some of the philosophies that you would want them to consider as they enter a fast-paced, ever-changing market that requires a lot of brain power and skill?
Yeah, so the skills, we have to teach some skills because you have to have a certain minimum number of skills to get hired. I worry less about, do you have this skill? I mean, people come to me and say, you need to know Power BI, or you need to have Python, or you need to have this code, or Julia, or whatever's coming out. I worry less about what the particular skills are, although I know we have to have a base set of skills. I worry about the critical thinking, right? And the self-learning. And so how do we teach people to continue to learn throughout their life? And how do we teach them to think very critically? I think this Gen AI and Copilot and others means that eventually, academia moves slow, but eventually we can take the skill of coding into a skill of critical thinking and logic and not necessarily have to focus on syntax as much. So I'm hoping that over the next 5 years, one of the evolutions we'll do is get rid of some of the coding classes that we have to take, make room in our schedule to really think about logic and scheduling. And then the other approach we take, so we founded our School of Data Science in 2020. The approach we took was very different than many others that are out there. So we have our computer science core, we have our statistics and mathematics core, but then we have what's called our data science core. So there's 3 areas, 3-legged stool if you want to think about that. All of our data science are co-taught. So I have a philosopher or a social scientist standing next to a computer scientist in every one of my classes. So we embed ethical thinking and reasoning and reading and writing, so critical reading and writing into every one of our data science classes. A lot of times your data science programs, computer science programs will have one class on ethics, right? And so you do a bunch of reading in ethics, it's like a philosophy 101 class, and everybody forgets it as soon as they're done with the final. What we're trying to do is embed that practice of critically evaluating and reading things and being able to turn that into logical thinking and reasoning and questioning within our whole core. And so that's a different approach, but I think that's a very important as we go into the future, how our students will need to, number one, self-learn, right? So what we learned, all of us, when we went to school, we're probably not using a whole lot of that skill. We've learned since then, and we continually learn, and so that's important. And then the critical thinking, it's almost like humanities are actually coming back. Becoming more important than they maybe have been in the past. And I know that's probably a controversial statement, but that's kind of where my head is right now. All right, I think we're at 5:30. I think we'll stop there. And so thank you very much. I'm happy to talk at the networking.